couple things in what's called the prologue, the beginning of the letter. And again, it is a letter. Don't get Revelation confused with anything else. It is truly a letter. It is from John to the 7 churches, and the word letter comes up often. So it is a letter, but it's a prophetic letter, and it's an apocalyptic letter, and meaning it's about the end, and it's also full of signs and symbols. The Greek word is semeno or semia, which is close to semia, although I don't know where she went now. Although I was going to say it's really close to her name. In Greek is semia or semeno, means a symbol or to signify something. So there's going to be a lot of metaphors, a lot of allegories, and a lot of hyperbole. So what we're going to talk about is a disputed authorship. Now, as even Pastor Joe prayed us in, he says we're excited to learn this book, this letter that John wrote. There is no dispute that John wrote it. Now, John did write it. Who John is the one that's up for debate. It says I, John, 5 times in this letter. I, John, I, John, I, John. The question is this Apostle John? Or is this another believer named John? And that's why it gets disputed. And I'll explain why it's disputed. Because at first you might be thinking, why would there even be a dispute? It says it's John. Who else is there but Apostle John? But we'll look into why it's disputed. And then the second box is why it's such a big deal regarding the authorship. So I'll talk about the authority, the date that it was written, because the date that it was written will have a huge effect on one of the 4 ways you can interpret this book. Again, I said there's 4 ways. We've got to make sure we understand. So there's the first one, I'll give it to you real quick. The first one is called the preterist. And the preterist is Latin for past or fulfilled. So it means everything in this book is fulfilled. Another one is called the historist. The historist means it's a sequence of history all through time from the birth of Christ to the return of Christ, and it's in sequential order. The next one is the futurist, meaning none of this has happened. This is all in the future. The last one is the spiritualist, meaning every generation is going through things that are talked about in Revelation, and Revelation speaks of symbolic ideals and truths that every generation will face. So again, the preterist, the historist, the futurist, and the spiritualist. Got it? Now, when we talk about the rapture and pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, premillennial, post-millennial, all those discussions are within one view called the futurist. So when people say, well, I'm a pre-trib, I'm post-trib, and we're so different, you're actually very, very close. You're actually the same view. You just have a different particular in that one view, called the futurist. So when people make this big deal, I'm a pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib, again, that's great. You can divide on that if you got different interpretations. But again, those teachings all fall within the same view called the futurist. Did I lose anyone so far? So I'll probably lose you eventually. Okay, so the date that it was written is a big deal because the preterist, which believes that this is all, at this point for society, everything in Revelation is past, because it was all fulfilled in 70 AD with the fall of Jerusalem. Now, for that to be true, though, the book would have to be written prior to 70 AD, obviously. But there's a debate, because we can't figure out exactly when this book was written. It's either 60s or 90s. So the date is a big deal, because it'll eliminate one view entirely. Okay, and then the style or the genre. The style of the genre, it's apocalyptic. The first verse says this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. In Greek, the word is apocalypsis. Apocalypsis just means to unveil. Remember Jerome in the 400s, he took some books out of the Bible. He took some books which he thought shouldn't be in the Bible and made them apocrypha, which is hidden. So the opposite or the antonym to apocrypha is apocalypse. Apocalypse just means to unveil. Right, so they're just Greek words. So if I took this water bottle, and I hid it, the water bottle's not apocrypha. It's still there, but it's hidden from your eyes. If later on I said, hey guys, here it is the whole time, it would be revealed. That's apocalypse. So the book is titled, and the title has changed through the centuries. Typically the title of any book is just the first sentence of the letter, which is what it is here. The first sentence is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Which God gave to John through the churches. But the title is just simply that, the revelation of Jesus Christ. The Catholic Church just keeps the Greek title, Apocalypse. So if you have a Catholic Bible, it will just simply say Apocalypse, which is fine. That's the name of the first verse, basically, the revealing of Jesus Christ. So again, apocalypse or revealing, that's what they mean, to be unveiled or to show. So that's the title. And again, the style, it's apocalyptic. That's the English word we get from apocalypsis. And apocalyptic literature is typically about something that's cataclysmic, something that's full of symbolism and metaphors and allegories, and it's speaking about something of the end. But it's done in a poetic, allegorical, metaphorical way. To take it literal would be, I think, a dangerous thing to do. So that's apocalyptic literature. This is like apocalyptic literature, on steroids. This is like very extreme apocalyptic literature. I'll talk more about apocalyptic literature and some of the symbols we're going to come across in Revelation. Just off the top of my head, some of them, like Jesus will be represented as a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns. Now, did anyone ever see Jesus as a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns? Of course not. He was a man and he was a carpenter. He was not a lamb, but he's spoken of like a lamb. But in this book, he'll be represented as a lamb that looked like he was slain, but he will have 7 eyes and 7 horns. The devil will be a serpent or a dragon. And there's all these symbolisms that we're going to get as we go through this book. And then lastly, here are how do we take all this and interpret it for us? When we read, how should we look at this? Well, again, there's 4 ways. You can look at this as this book was fulfilled and completed, all of it, called the preterist. There's also something called the partial preterist, where you believe most of it has been completed, but some, like chapter 21 and 22, the new earth, the new heaven, new earth, in the partial preterist view, that has not been completed yet, the last 2 chapters. But for the most part, preterists just think Latin for past. So preterist, past. Everything in Revelation has been passed and fulfilled. Everything. The second coming, the kingdom, you name it, the judgment, everything. The other view, historist, sequence. The next one, futurist. None of it's happened. None of it. So the preterists and futurists are almost completely opposite, right? One's completely past, and one is completely future. And then there's the spiritualist. The spiritualist, which says everything is symbolic for what this generation is facing now on a spiritual explanation or spiritual plane. So that will end with the 4 different views. I saw 2 questions, unless they all related to the TV going out. Okay, then there was no questions at all. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so this first one, disputed authorship. You guys ready? All right, so disputed authorship. Who wrote the book of Revelation? So we can't say emphatically who wrote Revelation. John, guaranteed. I know that because it says it 5 times in verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, 4, 9, and at the end, chapter 21 and 22. So you have what's called like bookends. And in the beginning of the letter, he says 3 times, I, John. And at the end of the letter, he says, I, John. So it says, I, John, I'm telling you, these things was given to me by Jesus. And then at the end it says, I, John, received these things by Jesus. And when I say by Jesus, it's very interesting. What we're going to find is actually this letter was dictated to John through Jesus' angel. So Jesus told an angel what to reveal to John. Got it? So it's dictated to John through this angel. A couple times through the revelation that's given, John will fall down at this information and just begin to worship the one telling him this information. And of course, the angel says quickly, you stop, don't worship me. I am just the angel of Jesus telling you what Jesus has told me. So it's really interesting because it's almost like, as it says in Revelation 1, God gave a revelation of or by or through Jesus to the angel. Then the angel gives it to John, and then John gives it to us. So it's kind of this weird sequence of, explanations. But that's what we have. 3, John says it 5 times, or the writer says he's John 5 times. Now, the question then is, which John is this? John was a very common name, just like Jesus was a common name. That's why they said Jesus of Nazareth, and they didn't really have last names, so they would just say your name, and then they would say son of, like the sons of Zebedee, or they would say your name and then where you were from, and that's how you were kind of titled. So this person saying I, John, isn't any conclusive proof that it's the Apostle John. So can we get any more information if it's Apostle John? And also, remember, this book was not canonized until like 399 AD. It went through many Christian families and circles and communities and churches, but it was so bizarre It was just so hard to understand. Although many people read it, it took centuries for the church to say this is going to be part of the canon. The authorship has a lot to do with that, because if you realize that every book in the New Testament was written by someone who had apostolic authority, meaning they were sent out by Jesus from Jesus. If you weren't sent out by Jesus from Jesus, you had no authority to have your letters be in the Bible. Barnabas, Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement of Alexander, great Christians, great pastors, but they're not in the Bible. Why aren't they in the Bible? Because they didn't have the apostolic authority. So that comes to a big point regarding the book of Revelation. If another John wrote it, it might be really good to read it, but to consider it divine and inerrant and infallible and of God would go against church authority. So we do need to figure out if John wrote this or not, because if John the Apostle wrote it, then it will qualify as apostolic authority and it will qualify for canonization. If John didn't write it, I still think we should read it, but I don't think we should hold it as much weight as the other letters. So if you're wondering sometimes why, I've heard about the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Peter, and I've heard of all these things. And one, the church did not receive them as canon because either one, they were not sent out by Jesus, or they could not prove that the book was written by that person. That's what happened here with Revelation. It was hard to prove who wrote it. Once they had more emphatic evidence who wrote it, it was canonized. But again, 300 years later, that's when Revelation made its way into canon. So it is important to know who wrote these letters and the content, obviously, of the letters and when it was written. All these things come into play regarding what is in our Bible today for the New Testament. So Revelation had some difficulty. So maybe it was Apostle John, maybe not. Here's information against it being the Apostle John. This is why people say John did not write this. And also to let you know, not like scholars have all the answers. But I do read a lot of scholarly books and information of that such nature. Most scholars today do not attribute all 5 letters to John. Almost no scholar does. Right now, the majority of the church believes John wrote 5 letters in our Bible. The Gospel according to John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and of course Revelation. Almost no scholars today believe John wrote all 5. I would lean that he wrote all 5. But it's interesting that no scholars believe he did. And here will be some reasons why most scholars believe John the Apostle did not write Revelation. It was somebody else. The first one, the Greek style of writing is nothing like the Gospel according to John or John's letters, 1 John, 2 John, or 3 John. And when I mean nothing like it, I mean absolutely nothing like it. Like, there's no way, and I even believe this to be true, there's no way that whoever wrote the Gospel of John is the same one who wrote the book of Revelation. The Greek is just too different. You would look at the Greek in the Gospel according to John and 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, very poetic, very fluent, very high level of understanding of Greek. And then you read Revelation. The original Greek is very basic. A lot of, it's called solecisms, where instead of saying, hey, you are in trouble, you'd be like, you is in trouble. It's that kind of stuff. There's a ton of that in this letter. Like it'd be far-fetched to believe it was the same writer, because the Greek is just so different. It'd be like Pastor Joe writing a book, and maybe like Jackson or Sage writing a book, and then reading Pastor Joe's writings for years, as we just got done reading the Gospel according to John, and then read Jackson or Sage's or someone writing, and be like, hey, this is not Pastor Joe's writing. This is not how he talks at all. It's not how he speaks at all. So the Greek style of writing is so significantly different. That's kind of an ending conclusion to a lot of people, that there's just no way. They are too diametrically opposite and opposed one to another. Peter?
Could it be a function of the fact that the angels dictating it to John, so that's why you get that variation in the writing style?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been, because it was dictated, but I mean, if John wrote it, he would still, every writer still has their own style. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they all have their own style. Paul had his own style. So that's why it's hard to find out who wrote Hebrews, because it's not really, well, it's kind of Paul, but it's kind of not Paul. We don't have any evidence who wrote it anyway. So I think that even if the angel even if it was dictated by the angel to John, and if John wrote it, he still would have wrote it in his style. I mean, if you were to dictate to me something, I mean, I think I still have a little bit of Kevin's writing in there. But yeah, I guess you could say that the angel would speak very basic, though. I don't think the angel would be saying, you is, and that kind of stuff. Because I imagine the angel would have some sort of intellect. I mean, it's to the point where people are convinced whoever wrote Revelation didn't know Greek at all. And in fact, some people even say that it was probably not originally written in Greek. It might have been written like in Latin, and that it was translated to Greek because it's just so choppy with so many basic errors of grammar and stuff, and that kind of flow to it. So if John did write it and then wrote it exactly how the angel said it, then the angel spoke really poor Greek, and that'd be hard to imagine. Yeah.
Is there an argument that Gospel according to John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were dictated by John to somebody else, and then he's the author?
There's no evidence that's possible, but no evidence of that. But I'd say there's more evidence the other way.
Yeah.
That the opposite, and we'll get into that. Also in Greek, just like in Spanish, if you have a verb, the last couple letters of the verb will determine if it's singular or third person or second person. Greek has the same thing, and except it's on a higher level because not only do verbs get conjugated, but verbs and nouns and pronouns and definite articles. I mean, there's 24 ways to say the word the. So these endings called morphological tags or case endings. There's a ton of case endings that just don't match either, or they're choppy. So you have case endings that don't match as choppy, and as many solecisms. Again, solecism is when you're learning to talk, and someone will say, you is rude, but it's not you is rude, it's you are rude. It doesn't change the understanding. I still understand this person is saying that person's rude. So it's not like we're going to read Revelation and be like, well, we can't understand what it means because it's so choppy. You can understand what it means in the same way when a child says you is rude. I know exactly what you're trying to say. You're saying that person is rude. So it's not that we can't understand the content of Revelation, but just how it comes across is very basic, rudimentary compared to the Gospel of John. Very fluent, very polished, very pretty, very different than Revelation. Again, it's almost as if the writer didn't even know Greek. Some scholars say that it wasn't written in Greek, it was written in Latin or Hebrew and then translated to Greek. Another reason against it being John is that John goes out of his way every single time not to say his name. In fact, if you look at the Gospel according to John, which I believe John wrote, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, which I believe he wrote those as well, he never once, not once, says his own name. And to me, that speaks volumes, because that's just not his style to say John. I mean, if he said his name once, at least, in John, or 1st, 2nd, 3 John, then I could say, well, he's done it before, there's precedence. But the fact that John never once said his name in any of the 4 letters makes it wonder, if you're, are we on, by the way? Are we? Okay, that's good to know. I'm not sure if Phyllis is, hopefully at least, enjoying this so far. I love you, sis. Praying for you. I don't know, maybe. You can tell who's on, or how many are on there, maybe, or it'd be hard. All right, so John, yes. So John never says his name, even if you remember when John was speaking about the crucifixion of Jesus in the Gospel according to John. Remember, John went so far out of his way not to say who he was, he didn't even mention his own mother. Remember that? Yeah. He says Mary was there, Mary Magdalene, and another woman. But then we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the other woman was Salome. We know that Salome was Zebedee's wife. Well, James and John were the sons of Zebedee. So John didn't even mention his own mom at the crucifixion because he wanted to remain anonymous. So that's a concern. There's other evidence against John, but I just wanted to kind of give you, I think, 2 big ones that make it seem like it's not John. Now, the evidence for the authorship being Apostle John. Maybe now I've already convinced you there's no way that it is John, which is fine, because that's what I want. I want to give you evidence for both sides. I still lean that it's John, and you might be thinking, how can you still lean that it's John, knowing that he never uses his name and the Greek style is nowhere near what it was in the other letters. First of all, we do know from church history that the Apostle John was sent to the island of Patmos. That at least puts the Apostle John in the place of this writer saying that he's John, because it says, I, John, was on the island of Patmos. So to me, that's a good indication. Now, if we have no church history at all ever of the Apostle John being on Patmos, then I think it's a slam dunk. It could not have been John, because there's no evidence of John being on Patmos. But the fact that we know from Polycarp and Ignatius and others that John was on the island of Patmos at least puts John in contention of being the writer. Remember, Polycarp was John's disciple. And John discipled Polycarp to be a pastor, I believe, in Ephesus. And Polycarp writes that John was on Patmos. So that's a good thing, right? Knowing that he was there. In verse 9, it says, I, John, was on the island that is called Patmos for the word of God and testimony of Jesus. So again, we know that John was on Patmos. This puts, again, Apostle John, sorry. I might say Paul a lot just because we're so used to saying Paul, but we've been studying John. This puts John at least Patmos when the book was written. Now, regarding the Greek style of writing and how it was so different, it is possible that due to his condition, confines, or limitations, that John used what's called an amanuensis. You guys ever heard of the word amanuensis? An amanuensis is someone who I dictate to, and the person who writes it is called the amanuensis. So it is possible, let's say that John, because he was in jail or on Patmos, and maybe he was beaten, or maybe he couldn't write, or maybe his arms were tied up, I don't know. But for any reason, I think it's very possible that John, as he's getting the revelation, he's speaking to someone else, and then that someone else is writing the book of Revelation. Make sense? And I think that's very possible. In fact, Paul did this. Remember, Paul lost his eyesight. He did it completely at one point, but then it came back. But as we know from church history, Paul struggled with his eyes, correct? And because Paul struggled with his eyesight, a lot of times he didn't write the letters. And what Paul would do, if you remember, he would just sign his name at the very end. So Paul would use an amanuensis. So if Paul used an amanuensis because he couldn't write because of his eyes, well, it's very possible that John used one as well, that John dictated this information to somebody else, and that somebody else wrote it. That would at least explain why the writing style is so different than John's. And then another reason I think that kind of corroborates that it still could have been John is that a lot of the words that John uses, like in the Gospel of John, are still in the book of Revelation. So it sounds like his words, but not his writing style. So if John was in jail and for whatever reason couldn't write for a myriad of reasons, beaten, hurt, malnourished, I don't know, or maybe he just didn't have a pen and paper. Maybe he's in a jail and he doesn't have pen and paper, but he's speaking out a window to someone who does. I mean, I can come up with all kinds of reasons where John would use an amanuensis, but it's very possible that he did. And this would have to be really the main way to explain why the Greek writing style is so different. That John, this did come from John the Apostle's lips. He was on Patmos, but he wasn't the actual, writer. That he dictated the visions to an amanuensis. And I think that's very possible. Another linkage to the Apostle John is, again, by these key words that are found only in Revelation and John. I think that's interesting. The style might be very different from the Gospel to the book of Revelation. But you ever know someone who has a saying, they always say it, and you know when you hear those words, that's just what that person always says. That's kind of like their cliche words. That's just how they speak. Like, I don't know. Phyllis always says, oh my gosh. She says that a lot. And I know Monica will say certain words, and that's just kind of the way she, or people say like, and all that. There's just certain ways people speak that kind of determines, that's like your style of how you speak. So here we have in Revelation some words that are only in Revelation and the Gospel according to John. Kind of links the writer. So again, that would really help explain why the style is so different. John dictated it to an amanuensis. But it is John, because he was in Patmos, and these words that John uses only in the Gospel and are found only in the book of Revelation is another linkage between the two. Here are just some. The Word, right? So we have the Word, the Logos. In John 1:1, the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's John 1 and John 1:14. But also in 1 John 1:1, John says the Word of God, which we have handled, and we have touched, and we have seen. He calls Jesus the Logos, the Word. Well, what do we get in Revelation? Also in 1 John 5:7, there are three that bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, the Holy Spirit. And then that's just the way John speaks of Jesus, as the Logos, the Word. But in Revelation, we have the Logos, the Word again. So we have Jesus looked at and called the Word almost exclusively by John. So kind of a link there. Also, the Apostle John very commonly refers to Jesus as the Lamb of God. In John 1, later on, John writes, "Behold, the Lamb of God," John the Baptist said it, but John wrote it. Jesus is considered the Lamb. That's how John looks to Jesus, as the Word, the Logos, and the Lamb. Well, we find in the book of Revelation that Jesus is looked at as the Word, the Logos, and the Lamb. So there's another linkage. In John, John commonly writes, "We must overcome." Nike, just like the shoe. The word is Nike, and it means to overcome, to be an overcomer. John writes that over and over again in the gospel. We must overcome. I have overcome the world. And in Revelation, in chapters 2 and 3, regarding the churches, Jesus says you must have victory, you must overcome. And the writer used the word Nike, you must overcome. There's another linkage. Here it's in John 16, I've overcome the world, peace I leave with you. And then here in Revelation, this word overcome is in John at least one time, in 1 John, and also in Revelation. So again, we see words that are only in John the Gospel, 1 John, and Revelation. I would say that is evidence that the same writer would have wrote the Gospel, the letters, and the book. And the last one, we have John tells us, I think in John 12, that Satan was thrown out of heaven. The same exact saying and verbiage is mentioned in Revelation, that Satan was thrown out of heaven. So these are just some. I didn't write all of them because I don't want to spend the entire day on box 1. But these are the evidences that it was John. You can make your own conclusion. I lean that it is John, that he dictated the visions to an amanuensis, and that's why it explains some of his own words stayed the same. And that's my thought. Make sense? Okay. Trying to help us have a background here. And you might be asking me, Pastor Kevin, that was a lot for what purpose? Does it really matter who wrote it? And as I shared before, it matters tremendously who wrote it. Because only letters written by those who had apostolic authority, sent out by Jesus, had the authority to have a letter or a book that was canonized. So I put, does authority matter? Yes, only apostles or those sent out by Jesus had the authority for the writings to be in canon. Now you might be thinking, well, what about Luke? Luke was a Gentile, and he wasn't one of the main apostles. He wasn't main 12. The church doesn't say that you had to be one of the main 12 to have apostolic authority, but you had to be seen by Jesus, see Jesus yourself, and sent out by Jesus. Most scholars believe that Luke was sent out by Jesus when the 70 were sent out. Remember when Jesus sent out the 12 in Matthew 10? But then later on, Jesus sent out 70 later on. That were Jews, I think, and Gentiles, because Luke was a Gentile. So most people believe Luke was sent out by Jesus around Luke 10. In Matthew 10, Jesus sends out the 12, just those 12 Jewish, Matthew, John, Luke, and the rest. So Luke was an apostle. He was sent out. Not to mention, Luke went on the missionary journeys with Paul and wrote Luke, obviously, and wrote Acts, because Luke was sent out with Paul. In fact, I forget where it is in the book of Acts, but you'll find when Paul kind of linked up as missionary journeys together with Luke. So Luke, well, what about John Mark? John Mark, I don't think was an original 12, but we do believe that he was sent out as an apostle. We believe that John Mark, which is just Mark, was sent out with the 70. And also we know in the book of Acts, John Mark went out as a missionary with Paul in Acts 12. In Acts 12, John Mark was sent out as an apostle by the church. And that puts him as an apostle, but does that put him as being with Jesus and seeing Jesus? Evidence says yes, he was with Jesus. In fact, there's a story in Mark 14 that the night Jesus was crucified, that a young man ran away naked. And most people believe that that was John Mark. Have you ever heard that story? In Mark 14, it says one man, the soldiers came to arrest everybody, or at least arrest Jesus, and they grabbed one young man, and he took off running, and they pulled his coat out, and then he ran. It's in Mark 14. It mentions a young man who took off, and the soldiers grabbed him and grabbed the coat, and he just kind of squiggled out of his coat and kept on running. And he ran away naked, Mark 14 says. And most scholars believe that was John Mark. All that to say, we have Luke being sent out by Jesus, and evidence of being an apostle in Acts. And we have Mark seeing Jesus and being sent out by the church in Acts 12. And if you guys remember the story in Acts 12, John Mark and Paul did go out as missionary journeys, and it didn't go too well. Yeah, so then 3 chapters later, in Acts 15, they were being sent out by the church again. And remember, Paul said, absolutely not. I'll go with Barnabas, but I'm not going to go with John Mark, because John Mark left us on the journey. So they actually ended up being split, and John Mark went with Barnabas, and Paul and Silas went together. So in Acts 15, there was the 4 split, became 2 teams. But the whole point is, every book in the New Testament was written by someone who was sent out by Jesus and for Jesus and by the church. There is one exception and only one exception, and that is the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews, we actually don't know who wrote it. So then you might say, well, if we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, how can we say that it's canonized? The church canonized Hebrews strictly because of its content. The content was so amazing, so divine, so spiritual, so powerful, and the fact that it was circulated in the first century, right around 65 AD, that they knew it was written during the apostolic, first century. And the content alone just makes it not of, man. It's just an amazing book. That was the book I was leaning to teach, not Revelation. I wanted to teach Hebrews. Maybe we'll teach Hebrews next. I think that would be a good thing to learn next. So all that to say, every book we have in the New Testament was written by someone with apostolic authority. And that's why it's important to know that John wrote Revelation, because Revelation was so difficult. Again, it didn't get canonized until 399 AD. It went around churches, but not everyone believed it was canonized. They had trouble verifying the authorship, and also sometimes trouble verifying what the heck it means. Peter? Well, the book of Enoch wouldn't be under the Christian authority. The book of Enoch would be under the Jewish authority, because the Christians wrote the New Testament, and the Jews had the authority over the Old Testament. In the New Testament, Christians are Jews and Gentiles. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, Luke being Gentile, John being Jewish. The Jews did not consider Enoch to be worthy of canonization in their Hebrew text, but they did consider 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, Tobit, Maccabees, all that, still to be important writings, and they kept those writings in the temple, but they didn't put it, and they put it in the temple as literature to read, but not actually canon for people to know that it was for sure of God. Probably because of authorship and some content in there might have been difficult to make sure that it lines up. So there is Jewish Apocrypha and there is Christian Apocrypha, because we have the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Mary and the other things that people have come across, and it's not in Scripture because we can't verify the author, or the author had no verification that they were an apostle, or the content just doesn't line up with what has been revealed. It contradicts. So these are the things that determine if it's going to be in Scripture. The Christians had the authority over the New Testament. The Jews had the authority over the Old Testament. Enoch and all those are prior to Jesus, right? They were written during the time in between Malachi and John the Baptist.
So John means strictly to being a notary or stenographer?
So John would be here. John would be the one who received the message from the angel and then most likely dictated it or spoke the visions to a companion, an amanuensis, who wrote Revelation. That is if you're going to believe that the Apostle John wrote Revelation, which I do believe. So I lean to the fact that he had an amanuensis, that John dictated it to somebody else who wrote it. Now, if you don't believe John the Apostle wrote it, well, then you can just say that this guy John, wrote it directly. But I think that it was the Apostle John. And I lean that way because it is in Scripture, it is canonized. And Paul used, an amanuensis at times. John could too. And again, I'm just, at this point in my life convinced it was the Apostle John who wrote it. Other writings by Barnabas, Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Alexander, all these other pastors that came as a result of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did raise up a church. They did raise up disciples. They did ordain pastors. And those pastors led churches after these first century apostles died. And these people, Barnabas, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, all these, they wrote letters too, and they circulated, and we can still read those. But they're not going to count as canonized because they don't meet the qualifications of apostolic authority. So it's important to know, I think, who wrote the Gospel of John. So again, there's Jewish Apocrypha, Book of Enoch. I mentioned that. Peter, you brought it up. Enoch, Tobit, Maccabees, those were all written prior to John the Baptist, prior to the New Testament. Therefore, the Jews had the authority to say yay or nay. And they said, nay, not garbage. Important to read. Let's keep it in the temple. It's temple literature. And read it, but not on the level of like Isaiah and Daniel, Moses, David, Samuel, that kind of stuff. So still there, and important to read. So same thing with the New Testament church. There's some books that are written, and the church couldn't verify who wrote it, when it was written, and the content of it. And they said, to be safe, it's not going to be part of canon. You can read it, but we're not going to say it's canonized. So there's Jewish Apocrypha, in a sense, and Christian Apocrypha. So if the Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation, then we can be confident that it's inspired and properly included in canon. Canon, by the way, just means genuine or meets criteria. That's what canon means, met the criteria. Now, the date of Revelation, compared to when it was accepted, there are two possibilities of when Revelation was written. Option 1, 65 AD under Emperor Nero. Option 2, 95 AD, which I believe is Domitian. It could be Vespasian, but nonetheless is not Nero. So this book could have been written at either one of those dates. The date does become important because if it was written in 65 AD, again, I'm trying not to lose you, but I'm trying to make sure that we're using our brains at the same time and understanding what we're getting into here. You all wanted this book, so here we are. One of the views, right, called the preterists, believes that everything in Revelation was fulfilled in 70 AD with the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. That when Rome came in and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and destroyed everything, that was what was prophesied in Revelation. All these cataclysmic events, all these destructions, all the people wailing, all the people screaming, all the people dying, all the land being destroyed. Everything that was prophesied in Revelation spoke of the soon and upcoming destruction of the temple. Well, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So in order to make this view valid, the preterist view, obviously the book had to have been written prior to 70 AD. If the book was written after 70 AD, we can knock down the four views to one of three. But since we don't know when it was written, at least not for sure, the preterist view still stands as an option. And the preterist view has some things going for it, such as you read the book of Revelation, and it is emphatic that these things are going to be happening soon, very soon. In fact, it starts with these things happen soon. It ends with these things will happen soon. And there's no way to get around the fact that soon means soon. At hand means at hand. So to say that the book is future, the futurist view has a hard time explaining what soon means. So they'll change soon to meaning quick, that when this happens, it'll happen quickly. Well, there's a Greek word for quickly, and there's a Greek word for soon, and it doesn't say these things will happen quickly. That's different. It says these things will happen soon. So the preterist has that going for them. What they don't have going for them, though, is any emphatical evidence that it was written prior to 70 AD. If the letter was written prior to 70 AD, that view stands. Most scholars believe it was not, though. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying the preterist view still has a lot of evidence. But we need to verify when it was written. That's why the date that it was written matters a lot. Not only who wrote it, who's John, but when was it written so we can properly interpret this. If John the Apostle wrote it, it's worth interpreting. When it was written determines how we can interpret it. So you see now why some people who just open up Revelation and start reading, I mean, it does say those who read it are blessed, and that's true. But there's just a lot goes into reading Scripture. And to just open up and like, well, that's what it says. And because it says it, that's what's going to happen. Well, understanding apocalyptic literature and symbolism, and if you don't know Daniel and Isaiah and Zechariah, you have probably no clue what John is referring to anyway, let alone how to interpret these things. So option 2 is that it was written in 95 AD. Again, if it was written anytime after 70 AD, we have to throw the view of preterist off the table completely. Not even an option. The book was circulated in Christian communities for centuries. As I said, 399 AD is when they finally said, yes, let's have Revelation be part of canon. Hundreds of years, it was read by Irenaeus and Tertullian and Clement of Alexander and Origen. They all accepted it. Jerome, in the 4th century, came to the conclusion in 396, Jerome, who was also made the book of Enoch and that kind of stuff, Apocrypha, he made Revelation Apocalypse. So Jerome did some things in the 4th century, the end of the 4th century, 396 AD, and said these books need to be hidden, these books need to be revealed. He said Enoch, Tobit, this kind of stuff, Apocrypha, let's hide them from the congregation. They shouldn't be read. But this book by John, let's have that be Apocalypse. So he made some Apocrypha and Apocalypse changes in 396, where Enoch, Tobit, Maccabees became Apocrypha and Revelation became Apocalypse. So that was in 4th century by Jerome. And I have a quote from Jerome. It took me a little while to find it, but I found some evidence and what Jerome has to say about Revelation. He says the Apocalypse, which is the title the Catholics currently call the book. They just call it the Apocalypse. So we would say the book of Revelation. But he says, the Apocalypse of John has many secrets and hidden meanings. It is beyond all praise. I mean, he goes on. He says a lot about it, but I mean, I can't give you everything he said about it in today's teaching. But if you want, it's called the Letter of Jerome, chapter 53, 9. It was published at least in 1966. That's by Jerome. And you can find more information on what Jerome did and how he lived if you wanted to study Saint, they call him, Jerome, and what he did. But that's how the book finally, after hundreds and hundreds of years, made it into the book, the Bible. So now we pick up the Bible and we just assume, it should be there. It's almost like for our children, they just assume the internet was always there. Well, but I did not have internet growing up. I remember looking at what's called microfiche, going to the library and getting this tiny little thing, putting it in this little light mechanism, and you put the light down, and then you scroll, and then as you scroll, you're looking up here, try to find, to the kids, it's like you just ask Siri, you just ask Alexa. I remember once Jackson or Sage, one or the other had, definitely one of those two, but they had a math problem, so they said, Alexa, what is 156 divided by whatever? And I'm like, no, you can't just ask Alexa to do your homework. But to them, they were born and raised in a time of internet and a time of Alexa. So they're thinking this is almost in their mind, this has always been here, right? And they'll even ask us, were you born? And was there this when you were born? And yeah, and all that. So the same thing for us, though, since this was canonized in the end of the 4th century, 396 AD, a lot of us just pick up Revelation and be like, oh, well, duh, it's in the Bible. But the truth is, it took 300 some odd years to get it in here. And it was very difficult to know what the heck it's talking about. Is it past? Is it present? Is it future? Who wrote it? Who's this guy, John? Why is the writing so different? A lot went into getting Revelation in our Bible. I do believe it's correct. I do believe it should be in the Bible. But before we even begin the chapter 1, verse 1, there's a lot of background regarding this book entirely. Now, regarding the genre of the book, it's apocalyptic, obviously. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, this is the apocalypse. The word revelation is apocalypse in Greek. So it is apocalyptic. What in the world is apocalyptic even mean? If you were to look up apocalyptic literature, the meaning it deals itself with future events that are being unveiled. That's what apocalypse means, to be unveiled. But it's unveiled using hidden symbols, allegories, or metaphors. It's filled with hyperbolic literature. The first verse literally says the revelation, this is the word in Greek, apocalypsis. Remember, there's like 3 or 4 letters in Greek that have 2 letters. So this is called a psi. It's P-S. So apocalypse, or really loops, is, right? Apocalypsis. And it just means the unveiling. So when things are unveiled, they're unveiled in an apocalyptic way, very cataclysmic, very, very over the top kind of explanations. So the verse first, again, revelation of the things that must soon take place. This is why the preterists believe it happened already, because it must soon take place, symbolized, or your version might say signified, but the Greek word here is sometimes Semia, which really is your name, or Semeno. S-A, right? That's an eta. S-A-M alpha. So Semeno. Ano. That's an N and an O. So Semeno. But Semeno means to signify something. Like when John just used this word last week that we studied in John 21. Jesus said that when you were younger, you went where you wanted to go. When you're older, you're going to go where you don't want to go. This, I say, is signifying, symbolizing how you're going to die. Jesus did not say you're going to be crucified. Jesus could have said that. He knows all things. But Jesus signified, symbolized how Peter would die by that proverb. So the word signify or symbol, it means something else. So we have here, the first verse, a revelation, an unveiling of what must soon take place, symbolized through an angel, or signified through an angel. So there's symbols. There's a ton of symbols. As I said, the Jesus will be a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns, and there's going to be a harlot, and there's going to be sexual innuendos of those who are faithful and those who are adulterous, and there's a ton of symbolism that's going to be going on in apocalyptic literature. So we need to understand that when we read it. The title, again, is just the first verse, the revelation of Jesus, which is the first part of the first verse. The Catholics keep it the apocalypse. There's been other titles throughout the centuries. Right now, it's just called, well, for us, the Protestants, evangelists, we call it the apocalypse or the revelation of Jesus Christ. Make sense? Okay, moving on. Apocalyptic literature, just a little more about this. It's a genre of prophetical writing. Revelation, again, means unveiling through semeno, symbols, and it is a prophetai. Prophetai just means a prophecy. Prophetess is a prophet. Prophetai means a prophecy. So it is an unveiling through symbols of what must soon take place. Got it? That's the first verse. An unveiling through symbols of what must soon take place. All right. Those are 3 words in the first sentence. It's a heightened form of prophecy, hyperbolic literature, metaphors, and symbols. Here's just some of the symbols that I don't think anyone in the right mind would take literal. In the green are the examples. Jesus will be described as a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns. That can't be literal. The devil will be a serpent or a dragon. He will have 7 heads and 10 horns. Demons will be like locusts and other dangerous animals. These locusts will eat men, but locusts eat plants, not men. So I don't think it's literal. There's going to be a harlot called Babylon. There's going to be a bride that'll be talked about as a city and also called the Lamb's wife. Another evil city will be called Sodom or Egypt. There are going to be several earthquakes. Stars, moons, and suns will fall several times. Heaven will roll up like a scroll, and there'll be no more earth. That's chapter 6. So if all that happens in chapter 6, and then we take it literal, it's hard to explain what happens in chapter 7 because the stars are back. The earth is back. The moon is back. But in chapter 6, several earthquakes, stars, moon, and sun will fall several times, and heaven will be rolled up like a scroll in chapter 6. The earth is going to end approximately 5 times in the book of Revelation. So again, to take this literal, which is an option, but I think it's an option that would be difficult to understand knowing apocalyptic literature. More symbolisms. Stars will fall to the earth. Again, I taught high school science for several years. Does anyone know here the difference in size between a star and the earth? It is significant. Stars are gigantic. A star could never fall to the earth. It would engulf and vaporize the earth in a matter of seconds. A meteorite, maybe. But yeah, but if a star were to come to earth, we would be burned up in a second. But in the book of Revelation, stars fall to the earth all the time. But in chapter 6, all the stars fell from heaven. There were no more stars. But now the stars are back. And now the stars are falling to the earth. So again, to take it literal, I think is quite a stretch. Not to mention what would happen if a star actually did fall to earth. Most likely stars are going to be symbolic of angels, fallen angels, good angels, and things of that nature. Some of these stars have keys. How in the world does a star have a key? But some stars do have keys. Now, if some angels have keys and ability and power to unlock and open things, well, that makes more sense. Rivers like the Euphrates will be dried up. This is where the futurist says this is all future because the Euphrates isn't dried up. So this hasn't happened yet. When you look at it literal, these things haven't happened. And since these things haven't happened, this all must be future. That's one view. The Euphrates, rivers, still there. Rivers are not full of blood. Stars will even bow down. And this is interesting because sometimes the visions look backwards, not just forwards, like this one out of chapter 12. It says the stars bow down, but it's referring to Joseph and how Jacob and his mom, bowed down, and Joseph had that dream. 2 witnesses are going to be killed. Then 3 days later, they come back to life. That has never happened literally. So again, if you're going to take this view as literal, as some do, they say, well, 2 witnesses haven't been killed, come back to life in 3 days. So it must not have happened. Rivers are going to turn to blood. Blood will rise to the horses' bridles. That's a lot of blood. Numbers. I'm going to end it here regarding the symbolism. Numbers are going to be hugely important. The number 3, or anything of 3, a third or 2/3 or 3. 1/3 is typically meaning minority. 2/3 will typically mean majority. So if 1/3 of the land is destroyed, or 1/3 of the stars that fall, it's a minority. To take it literal, though, was an option, but I think there's a lot more to it, the numbers. The number 7 is all over the place in Revelation. In fact, the book itself can easily be divided, and this is one thing all scholars agree on. The book can be divided into 7 chapters, or 7 events, 7 segments. But the number 7 is everywhere. There's 7 eyes, 7 stars, 7 candlesticks, 7 heads, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, 7 blessings or beatitudes. And overall, the book can be in 7 sections. 7 is everywhere. 7 meaning completeness. The number 10. 10 typically means something of the world. 10 days of tribulation, 10 horns, 1,000 years. I put in 1,000 years because 1,000 is a multiple of 10. Anytime you have a multiple of 3 or 7 or 10 or 12, it still speaks of that basic number, right? The greatest common, not the greatest common factor, but the basic multiple is 7 or 10 or whatever it might be. The number 12, which typically means order. 12 gates, 12 levels in the New Jerusalem. There's going to be 144,000 people, which is a multiple of 12. There's going to be 24 elders, multiple of 12. There's going to be 12 stars. There's going to be 144 cubits of the new heaven and the new earth, multiple of 12. So these numbers, you can take them literal. And again, in the futurist view, the new heaven, the new earth, at the very end, is literally 12 levels with 144 cubits. Or the 12 could mean something else. I'm going to have a hard time remaining somewhat unbiased here because I don't believe heaven's literally going to be 144 cubits and 12 levels. So reading this book, letter, literally, can be very dangerous exegesis of apocalyptic literature. So knowing that, how can we interpret this book and these metaphors? Again, one of 4 ways. The last box. The first one, called the preterist view. As I shared, it's Latin for past, and in this preterist view, every event was fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. So all these cataclysmic events were prophesying what was to come to Israel very, very soon. They believe it's the official end of the Old Testament was in 70 AD. The preterist view would say the Messianic kingdom has ended. It has been delivered to God the Father, but it is not the Messianic kingdom, because the Messianic kingdom would have to be completed. They also believe the second coming has already come. Now, some of you might turn your head a little bit at that one for sure. When you say the second coming has already come, now how in the world can a preterist make that claim, that the second coming has come? Very simple. The preterist view is that the second coming is not a literal physical coming, but that the second coming is a coming on clouds of judgment to Israel. And they'll get that from Isaiah 19:1, because in Isaiah 19:1, Yahweh himself says that I'm coming to Egypt on clouds to destroy you. So the verbiage, I'm coming on clouds, does have a precedent that it's not a physical coming, but that God is going to use another army to come to destroy you. So the preterists will view the second coming as simply a spiritual coming of judgment upon Israel, and that God used the Roman army to come on the clouds to destroy Israel in the second coming. So that's how they explain the second coming. It's already been fulfilled. It's not physical. It's a spiritual coming of judgment. Just as it was in Isaiah 19, God came on the clouds to destroy a nation, and God used another nation to destroy that nation. Make sense? And that would fit, because in 70 AD, God did allow Rome to come and destroy Israel and the temple. So they will say that was therefore fulfilled. The second coming was fulfilled. If you believe Jesus is coming physically, and most Christians do, because of Acts 2, as he rose, he will come back, and we're looking for the blessed appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, then you would not adhere to this interpretation. Revelation does speak about this happening very soon. It's actually mentioned many times. Do not seal up the words of this prophecy. Now, when it says do not seal up the words of the prophecy, that is in the end of Revelation at chapter 22. Now, do you guys remember where that comes from? Do not seal up the words from this prophecy. Daniel. In Daniel 8, God told Daniel, he gave him a vision, and God told Daniel to seal up the words of this prophecy. It was to be fulfilled much later on. We know from history, Daniel 8 was fulfilled 600 years later. So the theory in the preterist view is that if Daniel's prophecy was told to be sealed up, because it wasn't happening for 600 years, well then to not seal up the words as this prophecy was given must be clearly less than 600 years. Follow the logic? And that's a good argument. So another one, in Revelation, these things must shortly take place. And again, this time is near, and it's coming quickly in Revelation 22. So there's many times in Revelation, there's an immediacy. It's happening soon. It's happening soon. It's going to happen very quickly. And this information is not to be sealed up. This is to be given. So it's going to happen in a short time. Obviously, when this book was written would nullify or keep this view valid. So that's called the preterists. Okay? Am I losing you? No? Okay. 3 more to go and then we'll end. Okay, the second view is called the historist. Historicist, I guess technically. The historicist. Historical. And basically, I'll sum up the historist in this way. The historist view is that Revelation is a revealing of the end of the world through a sequence of time. So you have basically, in Revelation 2 and 3, all the churches. The first one is Ephesus. That first one would be the apostolic age of the church of Ephesus. And then after Ephesus would have been Smyrna, which would be from the apostolic age until about 313 AD. What I find difficult to believe about this view is their dates, because you got to have your dates accurate. So if you remember in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, right, there's 7 churches are mentioned. It's Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos. All the churches are here. Ephesus and Smyrna right here. They're all right here. So what the historicist believes is that Revelation is a sequential unveiling of history from the beginning of Jesus to the return of Jesus, and each church is a church age from such and such date to such and such date. So we would be, according to this view, we would be in the last church. But again, I think it's real hard to verify those dates. So in the historicist view, Ephesus was the beginning church. So they're up until the apostolic age. Smyrna would be the next church, which would be the persecuted church until 313, 18, or right around Constantine, taking away persecution from the church. The church of Pergamos would be the third sequence. Question? Comment? Okay. these are.
took place in those churches?
Well, in this view, is that this is an overview of church history. So these churches represent an age of time. So each church is an age of time. So Ephesus would be from the first century until the end of the first century. Smyrna would be the persecuted church, would be from the second century to the third or fourth century. Pergamus would be the compromised church from the 4th century to the 5th century. So it's a sequence of time for each church until the return of Christ. So you have segments. So the preterist, it all happened. The historicist is segments. The futurist, it's all future. Thyatira will be the rise of the papacy, the Pope, which they declare as the Antichrist. And that would last a long time to the Reformation. And it lasts like 1,200 years. And I'll explain how they get that long time in a second. The next age of time is the Church of Sardis. And the Church of Sardis would be for the Reformation to the Protestant reforms of Martin Luther. So age 1500 AD to 1648 AD was the age of the Reformation. The Church of Philadelphia would be the age of evangelism. No dates, though, are given for that. And the last church will be the Church of Laodicea, which would be like a liberal church, and that continues to this day. The problem I have, though, with this is how in the world do they get those dates? And how long can you be in this Laodicean church? Because right now, plus there's no dates for the Church of Philadelphia. How long was the evangelism church? Not to mention, I'll give you some other information here. The 7 seals are a breakdown of the fall of Rome, which ended at 500 AD. The 7 trumpets would be the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire with the rise of Islam in 650 AD, and the rise of the Pope, which is the beast or the Antichrist. And the 7 bowls are the French Revolution, which ended in 1799. The problem, though, is this view falls flat on its face at the end, because after the 7 bowls, Jesus comes back, at least in this view. But since it didn't come back, there was no physical second coming of Jesus after the French Revolution, it kind of falls. And just to kind of give you a little background real quick, how they even came up with that epic, that age lasting so long, this one, Church 4, the papacy to the Reformation, is they get this idea that one day equals 1 year, which does have a little biblical background to it, because Ezekiel was told to lay aside 1 day for every year that Israel sins against God. And so there is kind of a day for a year rule. But the problem is that gives you 1,260 days in Revelation for the Antichrist, for the Pope, if that's their interpretation. That would be 1,260 years. Well, if that were to be literal, which is what they claim it to be, then the Roman Pope would no longer be in existence after you add those together. After 1,260 days, plus the fall of Rome, the beginning of the Pope, well, it gives you around 800 AD. Well, the Pope didn't die off in 1800 AD. So all this to say, this view had a crescendo of around 1850, where everything is going to kind of be revealed. Jesus come back, and the Pope would be revealed to be this Armageddon fight. And since that didn't happen, the view kind of trickled out. This is called the historicist view. And since it trickled out, they had to quickly kind of come up with another view, because this one wasn't panning out. Their dates didn't really line up. And since it didn't line up in 1850s, the Pope didn't die. There still is a Pope even today. It's 2023. So they came up with another view that said, well, since all this didn't happen, well, then what must be is the proper interpretation must be future. There must be a future. This all must be future. That's why in 1850 the Pope didn't die, and that's why in 1850 the second coming didn't occur, because it's not. It's a futuristic interpretation. You get it? So the historicist view really kind of falls because of their dates. Now, you might still keep this view and just have to change your dates a little bit. And I don't know how you would change your dates, but you'd have to change them somehow. But the fact that these dates didn't pan out, and Jesus didn't come back in 1850, and the Pope didn't cease to exist in 1850, began the rise, I should say, of the other view, called the futurist view. Now, the futurist view, again, it came as a result of the historicist view not working. This view is probably the most popular view today. This view is held by Chuck Smith and John MacArthur and made popular by the Left Behind books and things of that nature. The futurist view says that everything that is in the book is literal, and since it's literal, it's future, and that's why it hasn't happened yet. It became very popular around 1850 as a result of the historicist view not really working out. And again, since it's literal, everything must be future. I've never seen blood up to the horse's bridle. I've never seen Jesus as coming out as a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns. So the earth itself, the new heaven, new earth, 12 gates, 12 levels, that hasn't happened. So everyone who is futuristic says the reason we don't see these things in Revelation is because they're literal and they have not happened yet. Make sense? So that's called the futurist view. So blood to the horse's bridle, the 2 witnesses being killed, locusts the size of horses eating animals, the mark of the beast, the Euphrates being dried up, 1/3 of the land destroyed, 1,000-year reign. They say, well, none of this has happened, and the historicist view didn't pan out. So the conclusion must be that it's a futuristic, literal interpretation that we're waiting for. So the futurist view says all the events and more are to be taken literal and in a future sense. The premillennial, postmillennial debate is how the kingdom pans out, and that's in chapter 20. The pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib debate, that's all within this view exclusively. All the other views has the rapture and Jesus being one event. Only in this view do they come up with the idea that the rapture could be separated from the return of Christ. And they get that from this Greek word metatauta. And metatauta simply means after these things. And in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, John says the churches in chapter 2 and 3. And then in 4, verse 1, he says after these things. So the futurist says, oh, after these things means after the church. So they say, well, the church must be raptured in chapter 4, verse 1, because it says in chapter 4, verse 1, after these things, all the events take place, after the church. You follow their logic? Because chapter 2 and 3 speak of the church. And if chapter 4 is after these things must mean after the church. That's their mindset. I think the problem with that, though, is the word metatauta, after these things, which is Greek, happens several times in the book of Revelation. Doesn't this happen just in chapter 4, verse 1? Metatauta occurs in the beginning of 4, 7, chapter 15, chapter 18, chapter 19, after these things. They're just visions. In other words, John's saying, after this vision, I got another vision. After this vision, I got another vision. After that vision, I got another vision. So after these things, to say that means after the church, therefore the church is raptured, and then after the church is raptured, after that, all these things take place. That comes strictly from their understanding of metatauta. But they'd have to explain why metatauta occurs over and over and over and over again, which I haven't had anyone who believes in that view explain to me why after these things happens over and over again. And to say that God's going to rapture the church and then pour out his wrath on the church with the 7 years of tribulation, that's nowhere in Revelation. The 7-year tribulation is nowhere in Revelation at all. It's only in Daniel. And that was to be fulfilled with the return of Christ, the Messiah. That's the only time Messiah is ever mentioned in the Old Testament is Daniel 9. So what the futurist does is they take the 7 years of the last 7-year prophecy of Daniel, and they'll say that actually is part of Revelation. Even though if reading Revelation, there's no linkage, off the bat at least, from the tribulation to Daniel 9. But that view makes it that way. Okay, this view believes the church is currently in chapters 2 and 3. So if you're a futuristic view of Revelation, you would say we're currently in chapter 2 and 3 and only 2 and 3. The tribulation has not started yet. The problem I have with that, though, we're going to read very quickly in chapter 1, verse 9. John says, I, John, your companion in the tribulation. So it's going to be hard for them to explain how the tribulation started when John says, I'm in it, and so are you. Now let's get through it. All of their views has the tribulation happening, or at least the rapture happening at the return of Jesus. So all the prophecies then in chapter 4 chapter 4 through chapter 19 will happen in this 7-year span in this view. Where they get that 7-year span from again, it's nowhere in Revelation. I feel almost as if pull out of thin air and it's not completely out of thin air, it's from Daniel 9, but to link Daniel 9 to all of chapter 4 through 19 of Revelation, I didn't want to know why you do such a thing. Chapter 20 will be a literal kingdom, a literal 1,000-year kingdom. And chapter 21 and 22 in this view is a literal heaven that'll fall from sky, that'll have 12 gates and 12 levels and 144 cubits long. And that's the literal physical heaven on earth that we'll enter into. That is the third view. It's all future and it's all literal. The reason it's future because it hasn't happened yet, so it must be literal. Okay? All right, I know we're going a little long on time, as always. However, the last view, and a view that I think would have some good points to consider. It's called the spiritualist or the idealist view. The spiritualist view simply means that it's spiritual truths. These are ideals of truth that every generation will battle with throughout time. I like this view because if it's the preterist view, then it's been fulfilled in the last 2,000 years. How relevant was the book of Revelation if it was fulfilled in 70 AD? If it's only a future book, well then that hasn't happened yet. It tells us what could come in the future, but doesn't really pertain to us right now as Christians, other than chapter 2 and 3. So the preterist view and the futurist view really push this book, as I would argue, not being as relevant. Because the preterist view says it already happened. And the future says that's going to happen. The spiritual view says it's happening. Where the historicist view says chunks are happening. You're in a certain chunk of this at a certain time. But the only view that has the whole book really being relevant to the current reader at any given time would be the spiritualist view. All of it is relevant, all of it is happening, all of it is unfolding. Again, the preterist view 2,000 years ago, historistic view, you're in one section of the church, of the book, but not all of it. The futurist view, almost all of it is future. I think to the reader, this view would have the most importance because it's what's unfolding in a spiritual sense, symbolically, what is happening and being unveiled at the current moment throughout the world. So in this view, sometimes called the idealist view because it describes ideals that you're going through, the ideals of Christianity, of spiritual warfare. Revelation describes fundamental ideas or ideals believers face. As I did say before, there are 7 sections in this book of Revelation. And what's interesting to me is everyone agrees on this. There are 7 groups. You have the first section, chapters 1 through 3, Jesus and the church, right? Jesus in chapter 1, and the church in chapter 2 and 3. Almost like bookends, this is how the book is going to end. You have the king coming and ruling and reigning in chapter 20, and then the church in 21 and 22. So you really have these beautiful bookends of the king and his church, the beginning and the end. In between that, you have the 7 seals. That's the second chapter, or second, what do they call them? Stages or events, or actually I think they're called acts. I think they're called 7 acts. So the first act is the king and his church. The second act is the 7 seals. The third act is the 7 trumpets. The fourth act are all these signs from heaven, and I believe there's 7 of them in the 7. The fifth act, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, is the 7 bowls. The sixth act is the fall of Babylon, and the last act is the king and the church, which is how it started. Really pretty. So you almost have like the church growing in the beginning and having problems, and the church perfected, if you will, towards the end of the chapters, which does make a nice bookend or inclusio to the book. The seals, the trumpets, and the bowls are metaphorical, and we'll find this out when we go through it. They all copy one another. So in the futurist view, Earth one day will go through 7 years of tribulation, 7 seals, and then 7 trumpets, and then 7 bowls. But if you study them, a couple things, as I shared before. The world does end in chapter 6, which is the end of the 7th seal. And, which is really interesting to me, the 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls mirror each other almost exactly. In fact, the seals and the trumpets, the trumpets and the bowls, so the beginning of the last, or the middle and the last one, they copy each other almost word for word. That's really something to consider. So if we're thinking this is futuristic, the earth is going to struggle through 7 seals of punishment, then 7 trumpets of punishment, and then 7 bowls of trumpets, seven bowls of punishments. Why do all seals, trumpets, and bowls mirror each other? And why does the world end at the 7th seal, and again at the 7th trumpet, and then again at the 7th bowl? My thought is that these are visions of what we're going through and how the world will end and what's going on from different vantage points, from the believer's vantage point, from the unbeliever's vantage point, from the heavenly vantage point. But it's the same story being unfolded. That's why the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls mirror each other, and the world ends at the end of all of them. I mean, if the heaven rolls up like a scroll in chapter 6, which is the end of the seals, and that's sequential in a futuristic, literal way, where do the stars come from in chapter 8 and 9 when they were destroyed in chapter 6? You know? You'd have to have an answer for that. So, and then also in chapter 11 and chapter 9 mirror each other completely. Satan is cast out in John 12, and he's cast out in Revelation 12. Satan is bound in Matthew 12, and he is bound in Revelation 20. My point is this: if this is all future, how come John, the Gospel of John, and the Gospel of Matthew, both John and Matthew, say emphatically that Satan was cast out of heaven already? Then how could it be future, right? If these gospel writers say that these things happened in chapter 12 and chapter 12, interestingly enough, of the gospel, and then you read the same story in Revelation 12 and 20, but then you say, well, 12 and 20, that's all futuristic, which is a very common thought now. Right now, what is en vogue is option number 3, the future view. That is what is en vogue right now. But again, the problem is that started only as a result to accommodate the fall of the second view, the historicist view. Because that fell, they said it must be future. So just because it's en vogue doesn't persuade me that it's valid, just because it's popular. In fact, sometimes I like to argue what's popular to the world is probably not popular with Christ. I can't say that for everything, but en vogue right now is that Revelation 4 through 19 is all future. But if 4 through 19 is future, and 12 and 20 at least 12 is in that mix, but the gospel writers say these things have occurred. Anyway, we'll get more into it when we get into those chapters. The tribulation, according to John, is now, in chapter 1, verse 9, he says, I, John, am your companion in the tribulation. And in this last view, called the spiritualist view, the kingdom is also now. It would go with an millennialist view, meaning a symbolic view of Revelation 19, that the kingdom is now, which I could show you when we get there, that the kingdom has begun with the reign of Christ. And Revelation chapter 1, next week, when we actually get into verse 1, now that I showed you all the ways you're free to interpret it, in Revelation chapter 1, it's going to quote Daniel, specifically Daniel 2. And in Daniel 2, you have the kingdom of God coming as a rock from the sky, destroying all other kingdoms. And when that rock comes and destroys all other kingdoms, that kingdom will last forever. So I would lean that kingdom begun at the birth of Christ, and definitely solidified at the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And I believe there is no gap in the kingdom of God. This is a discussion that you might want to consider with Mormons, because Mormons believe that there was a huge gap of the kingdom, and that Joseph Smith came to save the day, to restore the kingdom. I say no, the kingdom began at the birth of Jesus, and definitely at the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection. The kingdom began, and it'll reign until he comes back, not a 1,000-year literal reign. And we'll get into that more in chapter 20, which will be several months, if not a year from today. But if you read chapter 20, which is where 3 different views can come from, just that chapter alone, every word in there is a metaphor. There's an angel that falls down with a key and a great chain and gets a dragon and throws him in a pit and locks the door. There's no real dragon pit, and you can't, even if there was, you can't chain an angel with a metal chain, and there's no key that you can really, you're locked up, right? They're all metaphors. So everything in chapter 20, verse 1 through 3, is a picture of Satan being bound for 1,000 years. But to take 1,000 years as literal, when you take that whole sentence to be symbolic, how can you have one word in a whole sentence and say, well, that one word is literal? You don't really bind the devil with a chain. You don't really throw him in a jail. and you really can't lock him in there with a door that's shut with a key. We know that to be true. That's all a metaphor. But oh yeah, the word 1,000, well, that's literal. I've never in my life seen anyone interpret Scripture one sentence as all metaphorical, but one word, as literal. That's yet to be seen. To do that in order to make chapter 20 be futuristic, that is literal. So the kingdom and the tribulation are concurrent to one another in this view. You battle the tribulation and you advance the kingdom all at one time. Psalm 23 comes to mind. Jesus says, I'll lead you to good pastures, but then later on he says, I'll have you sit down in the midst of your enemies. And right now we can sit in fellowship with God even in the midst of our enemies. Well, the tribulation is advancing, but the kingdom is advancing. And these are warring against one another in this spiritualist view. So those are the four views. Preterist, historicist, which is a fun one to say, historicist. I would much rather just say historical or history, but I think to keep them all ending in ist, I guess. Preterist, futurist, spiritualist, and historist. It's not really historist, though. It's historicist, which I really don't like to say. But nonetheless, those are the four ways the church has tried to interpret these teachings, and you're free to interpret any one you want. I love good dialogue. So if you're confident this is all future, I'd like to know your thoughts on that. If you think it's historist, we'd have to reconfigure those dates, because the papacy, according to that view, ended in 1850, but it didn't end. It's still going today. So we've got to figure out why that view doesn't work. And that was really the only reason the futurist view came on the scene. And of course, the preterist view is very interesting to study as well. So these are the four ways we can interpret it. This is the background of the book of Revelation. Next week, there's no doubt, we will start chapter 1, verse 1, and probably go to verse 3, maybe. Something like that, and learn more about what the letter entails. But now you at least have an overview of the book. If you feel led, I'd encourage you to read the entire book. It's only 22 chapters. You can get it done in a week, and that'll kind of give you an overview if you want to take this literal or fulfilled or concurrent or sequential. Got it? All right. Hold the questions because we're low on time, but I do like questions. I saw Samia and Stephen, so I do want to answer your questions. Let's do our hymn, and then let's meet at least the two of us and talk. Amen? Okay, all right, thank you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the beginning, the intro to Revelation.